What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of the Struggle to Strength podcast, your source for real life application on how to turn your struggles into strengths in all things mind, muscle, and money. As we dive in here, I think first thing I'd like to do is kind of give our listeners a little bit of a background on you and let you introduce yourself and kind of explain like how you got to where you are today. I'm always interested in how people in your case got interested in movement is a lifestyle. It is a healthy based lifestyle, and we should focus on movement more than anything. So I'm curious, man, let's allow you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and how you got to where you are today.
Okay. Just go ahead and go.
Yeah, let's rip it, man.
Okay. I'm Ben Reuter. I'm just south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My real job is I teach for California University of Pennsylvania. My side job or jobs or fun or whatever you want to call it is I do a little bit of personal training, and I do a couple of podcasts that promote the ethos that movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity. One of them promotes movement in the Pittsburgh area. The other one, we literally interview people all over the world. I just interviewed Kate Baldwin from Australia last week. It hasn't aired yet, talking about strength training for endurance athletes, and kind of similar to what you guys are doing, partially to find out the story, because everybody's got a story. And sometimes telling the story is what gets the catch for an athlete, a client, a patient. And then the other thing is too much in our field, and I classify our field as movement, everything from the orthopedic surgeon, since both of you guys went to college in Vermont, you've probably seen him for ski injuries, all the way up to the person who is the personal trainer or the person who's working as a high-level strength coach. At the end of the day, we have a major goal. It's to make our athletes, clients, or patients move more or move better, whether better being faster, quicker, or better being with less pain. And too often in this field, we get stuck in knowledge silos. You know, the strength coaches talk to the strength coaches, the personal trainers talk to the personal trainers, and we won't even get into it, but the CrossFitters and the people who do something else, we're all a different category.
They talk to everyone.
And at the end of the day, the more people you can talk to, if you take one thing away from it, you go, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way. That might help you reach an athlete, client, or patient.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I think that all too often, like you said, we do get stuck in our sort of area of focus, and we don't open ourselves up to potentially an opposing perspective that might challenge our viewpoint. And that's, in my opinion, that's how you solidify your stance.
And that's an ego thing. I mean, I think a lot of times, you're good at what you do. You have success with the people that you work with, and God forbid somebody else tell you there's a different way to screw on the light bulb if you're not confident in what you're doing. I've been fortunate enough with some of the people that I've come across, they're confident in their space, and they're confident enough to say, well, I don't work with you. You're not the type of athlete or client that I work with, but I know somebody else. I tell this story a lot. I've been fortunate enough or unfortunate enough, and we'll probably get into this a little bit more since it's part of why I started the podcast. But from 2013 to 2017, I had 9 eye surgeries and 15 different procedures due to a retina detaching numerous times.
Wow.
Whoa.
And I still remember having to have a procedure in the, and first of all, I want to clarify, it was not at all the surgeon's fault. I have an eye that's extremely nearsighted. We'll geek out for about 30 seconds. My good eye is 25 millimeters front to back. My bad eye was 31 millimeters. However, the inside of the eye is covered by the retina, and it was the same size retina. So eventually what happened is too large an eye and the retina tore. So they would laser it and it would tear in a different place, and they would laser it and it would tear in a different place. And I still remember the importance of looking outside or being confident what you do and don't do, having to have a procedure in the office and the doctor saying, hey, I'm good at this, but my colleague is better and he's coming in this afternoon. If you can hang out till this afternoon, I'll see if he can do it. And at no point did I think, God, this guy sucks. At that point, I was even more confident in who he was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. being able to say, I don't know, but I'll find an answer, or I have someone who would be better for this. That's a huge just power. That's a huge strength to be able to do that. And you're right. It doesn't make less of you. It makes more of you. It makes people trust you more. And I think more people need to do that. It's something that I'm constantly working on myself. Now, I'm curious. Now, I'm like very curious about this retina situation. Is that going to be continuously recurring because they couldn't adjust the size of the eye, or how did they resolve that?
Well, they found out that I had this problem when I was 5 years old. They should, if they had, because who goes to see the eye doctor, when they're 2, 3, or 4?
Yeah.
They found out when I was 5. They gave me a patch to put on my good eye and really strong lenses for the bad eye. And I fell downstairs and I ran into trees. And unfortunately, it was too late. So all of my life, I've dealt with this. And since I was 9 or 10, they said, hey, Ben, at some point in time, you're going to have a detached retina. Here are the signs and here are the symptoms.
Oh, man.
And, like anybody else, it's like, okay, it's in the back of my mind. The only 2 things that I really noticed as a disadvantage up until 4 years ago were, number one, if you remember back in school when they do the eye tests and they'd have either the apple on the table or they'd have the little farmhouse in the distance and it was depth perception. Mm-hmm. I failed that. And I would always freak the school nurses out. And then I'd say, look at my chart. I don't have depth perception like that. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, and I'm saying this 100% jokingly to your listeners, it's the reason that I'm not playing in Major League Baseball, or the reason I didn't have a long career. I could not hit the curveball. I was a left-handed batter with a left-handed pitcher, curveball, no problem at all. Ball's coming at me, no problem. I can see the spin. A right-handed pitcher, I could not pick up the spin at all. And I'd be looking at the ball and going, oh yeah, that's going to be outside. Whoop, go in, strike 3.
Oh man. That's
so
wild.
It really, that really wasn't a problem until 2013. I was out running with my dogs in middle of winter, and I noticed what looked like a whole bunch of black hairs in front of my eye. I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. My hat's got a thread. And I kind of picked the threads off and it was still there. And I went to the eye doctor. He said, no, you've torn your retina, which is different from detaching it. And he hooked me up with this specialist that I mentioned. And I go in to see him and he said, yeah, you've torn your retina. He said, we need to get that fixed. I said, well, I'd like to schedule that. He goes, no, we do that right in the office. So that was procedure 1 and 2. And I was good for about a year. What they do is they laser it and they freeze it, which is very interesting if it's not happening to you. And I would say mildly to moderately uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Good for a year. And then it's about this time of night. All of a sudden, half of my vision in that eye just went completely black. It's like you put a sheet down. If you Google detached retina, that's the sign I had. And I knew immediately what it was. And that started a saga of 3 years or so. And in answer to your question, I see him every 3 months just to check to make sure. We think it's okay. I've got very limited vision. I've always had limited vision. So I have peripheral. But I learned with all of this, even that little bit of peripheral is nice. I would like to keep that. So knock on wood, the last surgery was February of 2017, and it's been pretty stable. But I also learned that one of the times I developed secondary glaucoma, and they put me on a very powerful diuretic. It was so powerful, and both of you can appreciate this as active individuals, that I walked from downstairs to upstairs and leaned over and basically could not catch my breath. This was a short-term. It's actually the drug was Diamox, was for those of you out in Colorado. They use that for somebody who has altitude sickness when they need to get them off the mountain. Mm-hmm. This was used acutely. The surgeon was out of the country for that weekend, and it was just, look, we need to get the pressure down. The normal pressure in the eye is below 20 millimeters of, I think it's millimeters of mercury, but below 20, and I was above 40. So it dropped it. But I remember going in to see him and saying, look, if I have to stay on this stuff, let's just let me go blind, because this stuff ruins my life. And I was very fortunate that the surgeon that I had is a cyclist. He's from the Netherlands, and he's a cyclist. So he understood the importance of being active and the importance of this in my life and in people's lives. And, now when I have my checkup, we spend, 15 minutes him looking at my eye and 10 minutes talking about professional cycling, because he really is a cyclist. And I think that having somebody like that really helped, but it also kind of segued into why I'm such a proponent of movement as a lifestyle, not just get your 2 or 3 workouts a weekend or 4 or 5, do more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I was thinking as you're telling this story. I'm like, all right, well, I've gone through several surgeries myself, and that's part of what makes me so passionate about being able to move well and do the things that I love doing. It's part of why I live in Colorado. I like to be active. I like doing active stuff. Even as a bodybuilder, I'm still mountain biking, snowboarding, and sometimes it makes no sense, but I love doing that stuff. And so I was curious about the connection. The other thing I'm curious about is myself having gone through many surgeries and with a likelihood that they would happen again, was kind of a traumatic experience to be told that, hey, this is probably going to happen again. And that, hey, some of the stuff that you do is not going to make it less likely to happen. In fact, it's going to be the opposite. And that's what doctors were telling me. So I'm curious, how did you deal, or how do you deal with any of that sort of like, for me, it's kind of PTSD type symptoms of, oh God, is this going to happen again? Or like, when's this going to happen? How do you deal with that?
It's twofold. It's first of all, while all this was going on, if you look up on our FitLabPGH Instagram account, 3 times a week, we do movement tip lifestyle hack videos, 1-minute videos. A lot of them are, you'll see me in the woods with my dogs. So one of the dogs you won't see if you go past 2019 is a chocolate lab. And in the middle of this, she developed idiopathic epilepsy.
Oh, man.
Shout out for pet health insurance, which I got after my first Labrador had ACL surgery, and I added up the cost. So by the time she passed after having idiopathic epilepsy for 4 years, she was on 5 different medications, and she also developed inflammatory bowel syndrome. But what I realized when she developed this condition, and I asked the neurologist, and I've joked about this before, again, yes, my dog had a neurologist and an internal medicine specialist.
A good dog dad.
Well, good dog people. When they first diagnosed it, the neurologist said to me, if you don't think you can handle this, 3 of my vet techs have fallen in love with her, and they'll take her.
Oh, that's amazing.
But what she loved to do is, I mean, if you're a dog person and you've got a dog that loves to be outdoors with you, she liked to be out in the woods. So I said to the doctor, I said, what can she do? And she said, she can do whatever she wants to do. So there are no restrictions on her activity.
Nice.
And about 6 months later, when she comes back in, we go back in for another follow-up, she said, I don't know what you're doing with this dog, but keep doing it, because her heart rate is lower than any other dog I've ever seen on all these meds.
Wow.
And it was moving. And I realized, I joke about this too, I'm probably slower since I got dogs as far as running, but I'm so much happier doing it, because you can't have a bad day when you go out in the woods. I mean, this as a mountain biker, even if you crash, you taco a wheel and you push it back. It's like, wow, something, maybe you saw where you are, maybe you saw a mountain goat where I am, maybe you saw a deer. Mm-hmm. So while this was going on with the eye and dealing with the Labrador, I mean, it was what you said. It was the PTSD. It was, I in the middle of this interviewed a sleep researcher, and they're giving, these are all these tips you should do for better sleep. And I'm thinking, well, that's not going to happen, because the dog rolls over in the middle of the night and I'm bolt upright going, oh my God, is she seizing?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have records with the Aura Ring of looking at my sleep quality the last 2 years that I had her, and then the 3 years or so since she passed on, or since I had to put her down because of a seizure that she didn't come out of. I will say, I would, if I still had her, I would without a doubt go back to that previous level of crappy sleep. Mm-hmm. But I could see that. And I could see, so that was a traumatic type of thing where you wake up in the middle of the night, your heart's racing, it affects it. There was always the perception of, okay, am I going to do this again? Especially because there was actually one instance when I saw the physician the day after surgery, said, yeah, everything looks good. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. And that night it tore again. Oh. And I still remember the next day. And I think this was my second surgery. He had just done my second surgery. I didn't really know him that well yet, because we were probably 6 months into the procedure, or the whole scenario. And I still remember he walks in the office, he walks in the exam room and goes, fuck, Ben, tell me no. And it's like immediately, it's like, okay, this is my type of guy.
Oh God.
And I mean, one of the things that really helped is I didn't really negotiate with him, but he knew how important moving was. And he'd say, okay, I want you to walk. I don't want you to run. You can ride the trainer. Or another time he'd say, hey, you can get out on the road bike. Be careful. I don't want you on the mountain bike because of the jouncing. And the thing that's really struck home, I think he said it in passing, everybody's an N of one. So you've had these surgeries that you've mentioned that you said there's a good chance that you're going to have them again. You're an N of one. You may or may not have to have them. Your body may or may not respond differently to how other people's responding. When we look at research and we look at what people do in anything, this is generally what happens, but everybody's the exception. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of it is first of all, accepting, we're not special, everybody has problems. And I think that's one of the great things about these podcasts. And you and I were chatting about it before. I mean, you can see somebody and think, boy, they've got really all together. I've heard people call it the Instagram life. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and they're just posting the positive things. So everybody is an N of one. Nobody's really special. And it really is an outlook of life. And I think part of it is having the experience of seeing what other people go through. I still remember a client that I saw for a long time, retired, big, high-powered executive, but just the most down-to-earth guy, had a kidney stone. It didn't pass, went in for a CAT scan to see where the kidney stone was so they could do the blasting. And they found he had stage 4 lung cancer. Okay. No previous symptoms at all. And I still remember talking to him. He said, this is going to kill me. He said, but I'm going to try to do as much as I can until it kills me. And the two things that really stick in my mind is one of the things that he did for 20 or 30 years is he went to, I don't remember if it was Vail or Aspen, like the first weekend in December, the first time when there was snow before anybody went there, just alone, and spend 4 or 5 days just skiing. That was kind of his reset mechanism. It's like, okay, this is what I do. And the year after he started chemo, he sent me a text message with a picture of him at the top of the mountain and nobody going down. Just him at the top of the mountain. It's like, okay, he was able to do this, even though he knows, hey, I don't know how long I'm going to be around. The other thing that his wife sent me, he ended up having a stroke or two and going into hospice. He had a new grandchild, and his wife sent me a video the night before he had a massive stroke and passed of him using the grandchild's stroller as a walker to push the kid down the aisle of the hospital. And if you think about that, the kid is probably, well, I'm not going to say how old he is now in case somebody's listening who knows it, but think of the memory you've got of your grandfather that you never met, but you've got this video. It's like, hey, this guy was dead the next day, but he was living life and enjoying it. So I'm probably going to name drop a lot in this just because so many of the people that I think with my podcast, it's not about me. It's about getting people's names out there. I interviewed I'm going to screw up whatever their titles are, so I apologize, but you can find them on social media. Connor Moriarty, he's from the eastern part of the state. He's a therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist. I apologize, Connor. But one of the things he said when I interviewed him said, look, everybody's got trauma. It's how you deal with it. And whether it's something you deal with intrinsically yourself or whether it's something that you need to get some sort of professional help. One of the things that he said, look, trauma shouldn't rule your life. You should be able to work through it or find a way to work through it. And when I say you should be able to, it means there is a way. You should not rely all on your life. It's always going to have an influence on my life that I had all these eye surgeries and I had a dog with epilepsy. Yes, there were negatives, but there were incredible positives too. And I know it sounds kind of crazy, but some of the experiences that I've been able to have, like I've come in contact and developed a relationship with a phenomenal chiropractor, athletic trainer here in the Pittsburgh area, Pete Thomas, who I'm coming back from all these eye surgeries and I keep hurting my back. And I've got a history of disc herniations, bad genetics, et cetera. And I keep hurting my back and this and that. And finally I go see Pete because he was recommended to me by 2 physiatrists. And he looks at me, he goes, look, you're training like it was 2012. It's 2017. You had altered activity for 4 years. Slow down and come gradually back. And it's like a light bulb went off, just like when the retinal surgeon said everybody's an N of one. It's like a light bulb went off. It's like, oh, well, that's exactly what I tell clients or athletes when I worked as an athletic trainer. Why am I such a dummy that I didn't recognize that for myself? And that's kind of comes around to what I mentioned a few minutes ago. None of us is special. Mm-hmm. I'm an N of one. So I'm going to react to things differently than you're going to react, but we're still not going to change the basis of physiology. If I'm training like I'm in really good shape and I'm not in really good shape, good things are not going to happen.
Yep. Yeah, man. And I like the direction that this conversation is headed, because what you're talking about, and it doesn't sound crazy to me at all. Having gone through my own several struggles, continuing to go through struggles, continuing to deal with trauma and injuries and recovering from, things that have happened in my past. I think all of us have. I mean, that's the reason we started the podcast. It's the Struggle to Strength podcast. There's always strength in struggle. There is no strength without it. So, although you've been through these very challenging adversities, which have, of course, altered your life, and many people from the outside perspective might, think, oh man, that's unfortunate. And yeah, did we wish it would happen? Maybe, maybe not. But has it changed our life with a possibility to make it better? Absolutely. So we need to be able to just see the brighter side of that coin. And that's why I was curious to know about how you're managing all this, because I think that that's something that everyone can learn something from. And then additionally, you've mentioned a few times here, and we may be switching gears a little bit, but you mentioned a few times here, just the practice of doing better. So at first you were talking about moving more and just moving better. And then you're saying how, your chiro that you had met, or the trainer that you were just speaking of, told you to slow down and work on making things better. And of course, in our own practice, yeah, of course, we know that our clients need this. Why is it so hard for us to do it ourselves? We need someone else to tell us. And it's like this light bulb goes off and you're like, yeah, of course, that's what I would tell a client. What would I tell a client? So we're talking about moving better, and with better movement becomes more just like longevity in our healthy movement patterns. So I'm curious, from your perspective, there's so many different types of movement, and we talked about a lot of them: cycling, hiking, mountain biking, snowboarding, lifting weights, running. What are the best movements or the best activities that you think provide the best benefit for just overall health, longevity, and movement patterns?
I'm going to answer that two ways.
Okay.
I'm going to answer that with my air quotes, professional hat on, exercise physiologist, teaching and saying, well, we should follow the World Health Organization and the various professional organizations. You should be in the gym or do resistance training 3 days a week, 2 or 3 days a week. You should do your cardiovascular training 3 to 5 days a week.
I love this answer already, by the way.
Ideally, yes.
Now, it depends.
But let's look at the statistics, or let's look at what we see. We're an anomaly. We're here talking about movement where it's the norm to us. And when we can't do it, we're like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
The clients that you work with, even if they're struggling to lose weight or struggling to improve their fitness or struggling to get out of pain, they're the anomaly because they're doing something. You're a little bit different in Colorado, but it's still not that high. There's a significant portion of the population, let's just talk about the US, that does nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So ideal world, this is what we teach. This is what you should do. I'd like to see you 2 to 3 times a week in the gym, or I'd like to see you once in the gym and have you go on your own twice a gym. A lot of people aren't going to do that. So what's the best type of exercise? Something they'll do. If you can get them to do something, or get us, I don't like to say them like it's an us versus them, but if you can get someone to do something, then maybe you can build on that. Mm-hmm. So if you think, for example, if your goal isn't to mountain bike or your goal isn't to bodybuild, but your goal is to simply get through the day without having to sit down and rest because you're tired, and you do something, maybe you just say, okay, I'm going to start out and I'm going to walk for 5 minutes, or I'm going to work with Josh and he's going to give me some body weight exercises, or maybe it's even less than body weight. Maybe we're using a suspension trainer that I can do for 10 minutes twice a week. And too often, as you said, we're in the visual field. How do we look? I got a good friend of mine, Jay Dawes, who says, look, we have all these fancy things that we do. At the end of the day, most people want to look good with their shirt off. But as you mentioned, longevity, health, if we can get somebody to do something and they weren't doing something before, that's a success. And what I do with the clients that I work with, and what I try to do with myself, I'm a work in progress, rather than judging yourself on each movement activity or each workout, and I think those are two different things that we can get into, look at yourself 3 months ago. Say, how am I doing now versus what I was 3 months ago? Maybe 3 months ago, you'd sprained an ankle or sprained a knee skiing and you were hobbling around on crutches. And now you're just getting back to doing a little bit of light jogging if you're very athletic. That's an accomplishment. Maybe you had a herniated disc or you had chronic pain, or one of the things we know is happening with COVID is people are spending more time at home, more time sitting, more time sedentary. Maybe your back hurts when you spend the whole day sitting in front of the computer doing all the Zoom calls. I'm at a standing desk now, so if you see me moving around, I'm also on a wobble board. Maybe that's something you work on. And if you say, well, 3 months ago, when I got to 5 o'clock, my neck was just killing me. And now I'm taking the recommendations and I've got a little timer here. And every 15 minutes, I'm getting up and I'm sitting down and standing up 10 times. Well, how do you feel versus 3 months ago? And I still feel bad, but I don't feel as bad. That's an accomplishment. So ideally, we'd like everybody to do these recommendations of the World Health Organization, et cetera, but then do more. Because if you look at those recommendations, if you have absolutely the perfect client, and I'm not exactly sure what you do, but if you have somebody that you work with for cardiovascular training and resistance training, and they're like, look, Josh, whatever you tell me to do, I'll do. You get them on a program where they're doing resistance training 4 days a week, split program, obviously, and they're doing some sort of cardiovascular training 4 days a week, and you convince them to maybe do a yoga class or something like that. That's phenomenal. They're doing more than most. They're like, you're thinking that's the best client. What are they doing the rest of the time? I've talked about this. Here's another name drop. Yes. He's out there on a lot of podcasts, including mine, Moving to Live. He is a phenomenal person to make you think like this. Don Moxley. One of the things he said, it's like, if you do that, the rest of the time, if you don't make a conscious effort to move or do things that you enjoy moving, then you're essentially a sedentary person. Because if you add up the number of hours in the day, the number of hours in the week, and then you look at those 15 hours of activity that you put in, that's not a whole lot in the 100 and one of you's got to be good at math. 168, 172 is 24.
168 hours in a week.
160. So you figure I'm active 15% of the 15 hours of the week, which we would consider that's somebody who's a pretty high level athlete.
Yeah.
And we also have to classify or look at this differently. If we're looking at elite athletes, if we're looking at an elite bodybuilder, they may be spending more time than that in the gym. I'm not a bodybuilder, obviously. If they're an elite endurance athlete, I mean, I've seen some of these statistics for professional cyclists. They may cycle 30 to 40,000 miles a year.
Yep.
That's a sport. That's a profession. That's not health. And those of us, you may want to look really good on the stage, but I'm sure any bodybuilder that you talk to at some point has had the conversation with somebody or struggles with it. We don't have to get into this, but do I use performance enhancing drugs that may have health effects? If I do, how much do I use? How do I monitor it? Everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon or wanted to jump on the bandwagon 10, 12 years ago when Lance Armstrong finally admitted he doped. But if you look at the sport of professional cycling and you look at the requirements physiologically, and you look at all of the really good professional cyclists from the 90s and the 2000s and the number who have admitted to using performance enhancing drugs, on the one hand, you can say, yeah, I can see why they did because of how it was just a physiological stress. And then number two, before we start judging and saying, oh, he or she is a jerk, stop for a moment. If you're at the point where if somebody says, if you're just a little bit faster, if you just got a little more definition in this part of the body, if you're a little heavier, you could make a living or you could make some money. That's a decision that you like to say. I'd say, oh no, I wouldn't do that. But if somebody says to you, switching topics to another sport, you might be able to play 3 years in the NFL.
Yep.
I would like to say, yeah, I would never do that. But honestly, I haven't been in that situation. And if I was in that situation, Jesus, that's a tough decision because depending where you're coming from, depending on the other things, that's a tough decision. There's a really good book out there that anybody who's involved in sports or athletics or likes to watch it, I would highly recommend it. It's called Spitting in the Soup. And it talks about how drug use in sports started. It started way back in Greek and Roman times. It talked about how drug use in the U.S. and the former USSR, that's now Russia and all the other countries, how it was a political thing. The U.S. using them and the Russians and the East Germans using them for the Olympics because it was a political thing to win medals. So Spitting in the Soup, it's a really easy read. Everybody I've recommended to said, wow, that really makes me think. So I think I've kind of dropped down the rabbit hole. I think, again, we need to look at what people should do from the recommendations for health from the professional organizations, and then see how can we encourage people to become more active. I interviewed another guy, Dr. E, who splits time between Spain, Mexico, and the US. He does marketing for physicians. And we were talking about, and I've heard this story over and over again. If either of you have spent time in Europe or other countries, actually, Travis, I think I saw something, you were in Australia for a while.
Yes.
Did you notice when you came back how much larger our food portions were?
Oh yeah.
So this is a topic that's come up with him, with a sleep researcher, Dr. Ian Dunnican, how large the food portions. And Dr. E and I were talking, and he said, one of the things that just amazes some of my friends from the US is say, 2 or 3 nights a week, we have gelato. And we're thinking, without naming places, but you go for gelato or someplace in the US, and you get 2 or 3 large scoops. He said, what they don't understand is for us to get gelato, we walk out of our apartment, we walk 3 or 4 kilometers. We have a small scoop of gelato because that's what the serving sizes are. We walk 3 or 4 kilometers back. In addition, we may or may not have worked out that day. We probably walked 2 kilometers to the market. We walked 2 kilometers back. We did this, we did that. We were low intensity activity. And you and I were mentioning this a few minutes ago, Josh. Most people, when they come to a professional, they want to work hard. That's the huge thing. I'm not going to throw.
They want to feel it. They want to feel like they want to sweat. They want to hurt.
And that's the attraction of all of these high intensity boot camp classes, burn as many calories as 400 calories, et cetera.
It's unfortunate, man.
And if you look at some of the long-term endurance things, like the book that first got me started in endurance sports was by Rob Sleemaker, who was from Vermont, actually, who looked at the Scandinavians. The majority of training that endurance athletes do is at a very low intensity. So that when the time is to go hard, they can go hard. If you're talking about powerlifting, if you're talking about bodybuilding, that's an entirely different thing. I mean, you're probably giving up some health. And I would say, Josh, you're probably helping your health because you're saying, okay, I'm going to give up some leg size because I'm going to go mountain bike and have some fun in the mountains.
I want to stay a little mobile.
and that's getting also into, you could talk about the importance of being outside and forest bathing or nature bathing.
Yes, man. Yes.
But if you have somebody who is taking 3 or 4 of these group classes because they're popular, there is the social aspect where you're hanging out with friends. There's the encouragement if you're more of an extrinsically motivated person, or maybe you have some trauma that you haven't dealt with, and people saying good things to you is something you haven't gotten a lot of. But God, it rips your body up.
It does.
Not one of them, but 4 or 5 a week. If somebody says I'm going to one of them a week, I'm saying that's great. If they say I'm going 5 days a week, or in some cases, they're doing 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon.
Oh God, yeah. It's so excessive.
I'm a little older than you guys, but guess what? The late 80s and early 90s called. They've already done aerobics. The big thing now is, the steps that Jane Fonda used. Spin classes are big now. I've got a good friend, Paul Swift, who I've also interviewed. He said, we were doing spin classes at the Olympic Training Center on spin bikes to train for cycling in 1986. So we need to think about what we do with movement. And I think, as you said, it depends, but more low intensity movement where it's a movement, not a workout, is something that almost everybody can benefit from for health. And I'm not talking about somebody whose goal is they're a performance athlete. You could make the argument for that also, but when they're a performance athlete, that's probably what they prioritize. I mean, I know I've known a couple of professional football players who are linemen, and one of their comments, they say, I can't wait till I quit football so I can lose weight. And we've got the guy who played 14, 15 years for the Cleveland Browns, the offensive lineman, Joe Thomas, I think his name is. I heard him on a podcast. He's down to like 220 pounds and swimming. He entered college at 215 pounds. He played for the Cleveland Browns at anywhere between 295 and I want to say 315 or 320.
It's a big boy.
And I'm probably paraphrasing, but one of the reasons he said he retired is that he hurt all the time.
Yep.
He had difficulty getting up and down from the floor with his kids. And, to go from 300 pounds to 200, I've seen pictures of him. He's not somebody where you're looking at, that's a football player. That's a guy who's in really good shape.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of what we're talking about, I want to clarify that when you're mentioning and referring to more movement, I think that a lot of people kind of think of, more Orange Theory classes. More insanity, more P90X, more. But what you're also talking about is managing stressors. And you talked about like forest bathing and spending time outside. And so what all of this comes down to, in my opinion, I'm curious to see if you agree, is this is all stress management. Movement should provide enough stress for a stimulus for adaptation, but not so much stress that you can't recover and you're contributing to excessive cortisol, like you see with all these high intensity interval training classes and people moving so much. That is an incredibly high stress state for your body. So when we're saying more movement, we're not just talking about more of what you're already doing, more Orange Theory, more sprints, more, and sure, do those things. But we're also saying spend more time outside, go for a walk without your phone in the woods, get some sun on your chest, like go for a walk, not just to get steps and like to get a power walk in, but enjoy time outside. Be a human.
Absolutely. 100%. I've actually had a couple of conversations with Don Moxley about this. Everybody has stress. Mm-hmm. Everybody. There's good stress or eustress. There's bad stress or distress. Mm-hmm. But it's still stress. Mm-hmm. You're not going to eliminate it. If you're in college, you're saying, boy, once I get that degree, it'll be okay.
Yeah.
Once I hit this magic amount of money that I'm making, it's okay. Or once I get these perfect number of clients, or once I win the Emmy in videography, or whatever it is. No, other stressors will come up. Mm-hmm. So it's all about being able to manage the stress and understand the things that cause stressors to you. Mm-hmm. And that's a journey. I mean, to me, one of the biggest stressors to me would be if you said, Ben, you got to go take a group class. And I taught 3 or 4 spin classes a week when I was getting my doctorate degree. I thought that was great. I had a great time. Now, you might say you're teaching 3 or 4 classes a week of this high intensity stuff. You're saying you shouldn't do that. At that time, I was training for marathons and Ironmen. So I was probably cycling 15 to 20 hours a week. So to do 45 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week of high intensity stuff when the rest of the stuff was pretty easy, that was the basis. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about more movement, I think you hit it on the head. We're not talking about movement for stress. We're talking about relatively low intensity for those of your listeners who are involved in endurance sports and you're familiar with zone 1 through zone 5 heart rate training. Mm-hmm. We're talking zone 1 training, or even lower than zone 1.
Casual conversation.
Right?
You can hold a casual conversation.
We used to call it, when I was in grad school, we used to call it either shooting the pooch rides, I don't know why, or burning carbon out of the legs. Just simply spinning, moving, conversation. And if you think about it, most of us don't do that. If you think, when was the last time you called a buddy up and said, hey, instead of going out for beers or instead of going out for that pizza, let's meet and let's go for a walk, or let's go for a mountain bike ride. A little different in Colorado. If you're a mountain biker, that's probably the way you meet. Two stories that influence how this is really subconsciously became part of my life is I spoke at a conference 5 or 6 years ago in DC. And a friend of mine who was career military that I'd met when I was at Auburn University had stayed in touch. I graduated from Auburn in 1999. We'd stayed in touch, Facebook, et cetera. Hadn't seen him since 99. This is 2014, 2015. Sam texts me and says, hey, I run at this park at 5:30 every morning. You want to get together for a run before your conference? Hadn't seen him in 15 years. Met him. We went for a run. It was like it was 15 years ago when we used to run 3 days a week. Same conversation, caught up with everything that was going on, spent the weekend with him, etc. Fast forward a couple of years, this guy was my major training partner at Auburn, probably had a big influence on me. He was a psychology professor there. He had retired to Salida, Colorado. Again, stayed in touch, had seen him a few times. Says, hey, come out and spend the week with my wife and me in Salida. Yeah, you got to really pull me by the hand to get me to do that. And over the course of 4 or 5 days, we spent about 20 hours on the bike or hiking, not trying to crush one another, other than the time that he helped me climb Chavano, which was 14,000 feet, and I'm a flatlander, so the elevation kind of kicked my butt. Apparently, from about 12,500 going up, about every 4 or 5 steps, I would stop, put my hands on my knees, and go, "Oh shit, I don't know if I could do this." Yeah. So he enjoyed it. But it's the normal, that's the sort of thing, the gentle movement. I've got a good friend of mine who's got 3 kids, fairly busy job. She meets a friend of hers at 5 or 5:15 every morning to walk. That's their conversational time. That's their time. And too much of it, because of the way we schedule ourselves, because of the places that we put ourselves to live, et cetera, too much of it, it's difficult to do that. I mean, if you can ride your mountain bike out your back door, you're much more likely to do that than if you have to throw it in the back of the truck or up on the roof rack, drive 25 minutes through traffic, which is a stressor. Then you get to the trailhead. So to kind of get back to what you were asking, or with the controlling of the stress, I think part of it is figuring out what causes you good stress and bad stress. And then what can you do to counteract that? Or what can you do, not to counteract, that's a bad term. What can you do to manage it? Obviously there's all kinds of things you can do, but like sleep is important. Eating right is important. And I don't know how you feel about this, but every time I hear the word clean, I want to clean eating, or words clean eating, I want to bang my head against the wall.
Yeah, it sounds so restrictive. I mean, I understand
because what is, and I'm not a dietitian, but what is clean eating? I just here in Western Pennsylvania, I grew up in upstate New York, and you guys, having gone to college in Vermont, probably are familiar with maple syrup.
I love maple. I used
to make maple syrup every year with my dad.
I just finished making 200 ounces of maple syrup. I pulled my taps last week.
Yeah, we used to make it every spring.
And this will last me for the whole year and be gifts for some people. But one of the things that we have to think about is, what do we eat, and also how much we eat. And I mean, that's an entire rabbit hole that you can drop down.
And how well does it digest? Because that's
and how well does it, like, I love, if I could have my ideal meal for me, what I would enjoy having every morning for breakfast, I would eat waffles. I love waffles. I don't like butter, but I would soak them in maple syrup. And I would be a happy camper. However, about 4 hours later, I'd be curling up in a ball going, I have no energy. So I don't do it that often. Occasionally I do it, and I recognize, okay, I'm probably not going to feel good. And I'm better now at 54 than I was at 34, when I would probably have 4 or 5 waffles. I'm better at saying, okay, I'm going to have 1 or 2. So it's choices that you make. I know that's going to be a stressor. I enjoy good beer. I enjoy good wine. But I also know that if I have more than a glass of beer or a glass of wine, my sleep's going to suffer. Now, sometimes, on a rare occasion, I'll have 2 or 3 beers. I know going in, if I'm socializing and doing that, I know I'm going to feel like shit the next day. And the neat thing about like the Oura Ring, or if you do other things to measure HRV, it tells me that too. I mean, on the one hand, it's like, I feel this bad. And then you look at it, oh yeah, physiologically, my heart rate's up 10 beats per minute and my HRV is down in the tank.
Yep. And I think a lot of people, when you're talking about sleep, a lot of people sacrifice sleep too often, either to get more movement or to have an extra couple beers or whatever it is. And just understanding stress and the ratio of stress is one of the most important things that I think everyone can do, but people have a mixed idea of stress and stress management, and they use workouts and high intensity interval training sessions and Orange Theory classes to relieve stress because it makes them feel good because they get that dopamine rush and it feels good, but it's just more stress. And then they wonder why they can't go to sleep at night because cortisol's through the roof. But it also can increase the likelihood for injury because the body's constantly in a fight or flight state. It does not have the capacity to recover from all the movement that you're doing. Not to mention, most people who are doing that much movement are probably eating in a calorie deficit, or at least poverty calories, trying to lose weight because they're aesthetically driven, not internal health driven. So one of the last things that I wanted to talk to you about was this concept of injury prevention. You're so adamant about moving and healthy movement patterns, and just, we all understand bodies in motion stay in motion. So what would you recommend to people who want to move, who want to train, but want to avoid injury? Because everyone gets hurt from time to time. You and I have been hurt plenty of times. We all come back.
And we'll get hurt again.
And we'll get hurt again. And sometimes we need a doctor to tell us to slow down and focus on moving better. But what would your top sort of recommendations for movement for injury prevention be?
Number one, and this would be for anybody, I would say have people or peoples, plural, who know more than you to act as sounding boards, whether it's the chiro that I mentioned that I go to every 3 weeks or so, not for adjustments, but for critiquing of exercise techniques, of things that I do to keep my hips moving, to keep my back moving, because he doesn't have that psychological input or that feeling that I have where I have to do this, where I'm different. So somebody who can look at it objectively, even if you're an endurance athlete or a bodybuilder or a professional, having somebody that you can bounce those ideas off of. Or if you're somebody who trains alone, saying, every 3 months, I'm going to pay for 2 or 3 sessions for somebody who knows more than me. And I know we get hung up on certifications and education, which on the one hand is very important. But on the other hand, like this chiro I mentioned, I heard of him from word of mouth. He doesn't advertise. There's a guy up in Flagstaff who doesn't really advertise, who's a trainer with limited quote unquote official education that does phenomenal stuff. So there are these people around. And I think to some extent there is, as we talked about at the beginning, there's the fear of, especially as you're more experienced or more high powered in your job, of having somebody look at you and say, damn, that was a stupid thing to do. You shouldn't do this. Now, maybe they'll couch it differently. So it's a good idea to have somebody who knows more than you so that you can bounce ideas off. That's number one. Number two, recognize the overall stressors. This is the perfect scenario right now. COVID is, I'm air quoting again, slowly ending. By that, what I mean is you're starting to see more in-person events and activities and things like that. So we don't have to get political on this. So now you've got people who feel like they've missed out on 2 years or a year and a half of whatever it was they're going to do. So they're going to catch up with that.
It's the roaring 20s.
Yeah. So really, again, this might be something that you talk over with somebody. And you say, is this realistic with the other stressors? If you know that you've got a busy project at work coming along, if you know that you're going to be doing a lot of travel, if you know that your husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse is going to undergo surgery or has a heavy work project going on, or your kids are going to be doing something, that might not be the time to say, this is the bodybuilding competition I want to enter, or I want to do this marathon in 3 months. Because now what you've done is you've taken all these other stresses that you can't really control, and you've thrown this additional stress, and your body may not be able to handle. And it may be that you give it up at that point in time, but you say, hey, okay, you're doing this. I want to be able to do something next year. So it's a give and take. I know a friend of mine, when I was getting my master's degree, his son swam, and they had a rule with the swimming. It's like, you have to be done by noon. So any event that you want to do, you can do it until noon, but then it's family time, and they'd go and they do other things. And I think that makes it much more well balanced. So I think number one is have a professional or a non-professional, somebody who knows more than you can bounce things off of. Number two is have a realistic assessment of what your stressors are, both good and bad, and saying, what can I do to control these stressors? Like if you've got a busy work project and you're training for a competition and you're doing a lot of traveling, your sleep's probably going to be compromised. You may not have enough time to prepare good food. So that's going to kind of turn it into a vicious cycle. And I would say the final thing is be very realistic, whatever it is you do. So me saying, I'm going to run a 2 hour and 45-minute marathon, which I could never have run in my life, is unrealistic. I think one of the things that it's difficult, I think if you're in activities that are figure-based, that's the wrong word, but I'm thinking bodybuilding. Mm-hmm. You can absolutely maximize your training for where you are at this point in life, and you could finish dead last. Mm-hmm. And depending on how you look at it, you could say, that's horrible. I suck. I'm a bad person. This is terrible. And it could just be an increased stressor. Whereas if you look at it as intrinsic motivation, I did the best that I could. Was I better than last time? What could I work on? Or if you're a runner and you didn't hit that Boston qualifying time, or you didn't finish the marathon because they told you were too slow, look at what you were able to do. So I think having a realistic understanding of your capabilities, and yes, push a little bit. So, but have it realistic. So when it doesn't happen, you're not absolutely shattered. Or along the same lines, have it realistic so that if you're currently not running right now and you say, I'd like to do a spring marathon in May, probably not the right thing to do because of the amount of time you're probably saying you're going to get yourself hurt. Mm-hmm. So 3 things: have somebody bounce ideas off of, make sure adding additional stressors for doing that can manage it, or you're able to manage them. And then finally, be really realistic in what you do.
1,000% agree with that. Yep. Go ahead, Trev.
That's also just super key. Even if you're just a person who's like listening to this and you're like, oh man, I realize, maybe I work out once a week or something, but most of the time I'm sitting around. Like I edit videos. I'm an active person, but I do spend a lot of time sitting. It's like, well, the next day I shouldn't write a list of like 100 things that I'm going to do every single day. And it's like, all right, let's just do one. Maybe I'll do every time I eat lunch, I go for a walk afterwards, and I just like kind of go from there. And like, that's so crucial for like these types of like health-based habits. Cause it's so easy to just be like, all right, here's my huge list of everything that I'm going to do. And it's like, you're going to immediately fail that. Like, there's just no way. And I've been guilty. I know this is like, I've been guilty of doing that many times, been like, I get stressed about something I'm not doing. And it's like, all right, these are all the things that I need to do. And then I don't do any of them. So it's
like, I know from experience that if I say I'm going to either move or work out in the late afternoon or evening, it isn't going to happen.
Yeah. There you go. You got to know those things.
I mean, I know despite the best intentions, that's not my ideal. My key productivity, et cetera, doing things is basically before noon, unless I get to stand here and talk. And I also know, as far as what makes me feel better so I don't feel like that, Travis, the non-negotiable is, where am I going to be early in the morning, 5 to 6 days a week, maybe 7. I'm probably going to be in the woods somewhere with my dogs. We're going to go at their pace, but I'm going to get that forest bathing or that nature bathing. I'm not going to have my phone with me. I'm going to be able to see birds. I'm going to be able to see deer. I'm going to be able to think. All of my ideas, good and bad, have come when I'm hanging out with my dogs or riding my bike. And I'm not saying that's for everybody, but I'm saying having time to think without all those external stimuli, which we constantly have, is phenomenal. And that's an entirely additional podcast episode or episodes. And I guess the final thing I would say is what I mentioned that my retinal surgeon said: everybody's an N of one. So just because you're seeing that this is what everybody's doing, you don't have to do that. Great example, if you've got time for one last story.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years ago, I saw in the Wall Street Journal, there was a cardiologist who was using a pogo stick to jump to help him with his osteoporosis. He was a researcher. He knew he wasn't going to exercise. So he would go out and he would bounce up and down for 5 to 10 minutes,
That's awesome.
a couple of times a day, 3 or 4 times a week. And apparently it was working. And I saw this and I looked up, and these are pogo sticks that you pump up with a bicycle pump. And I looked up, it's like they were quite expensive. It's like, yeah, okay. And then through the wonders of social media, about 3 years ago, I noticed that the marketing company that arranges the guys who do the pogo sticks at like the halftime of NBA games where they jump around was based in Pittsburgh. So I said, can we interview you for FitLab Pittsburgh? We show up, he's got these pogo sticks where people can jump 10 feet in the air. I said, can I try it? It's like, sure. I have a pogo stick that I pump up and I go in the backyard and I bounce around. Now I am pretty confident that I am the only person in Washington County, Pennsylvania, who has a pogo stick that he pumps up with an air pump and goes and bounces in the backyard. And at the end of the day, I really don't care because it's fun. So I think when you get to it, when you're doing movement activities, it's got to be fun.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not fun, you're not going to do it. Once it's fun, then you can say, okay, what do I need to do so that I can continue to do these fun things, maybe do more of these fun things so it doesn't get hurt. But we get old and people are like, well, I can't do that. I'm too old, or I can't do that. Somebody will think that. I've got a guy that I interviewed here in the Pittsburgh area. He's got a skateboard company, Local 5 longboards. He and his neighbor share a half pipe in the backyard.
Sick.
For the kids, except Jeff shreds on it also. And he's older than me. He's in his 60s. So have fun with your movement. And it's not just a workout that you give up. Just move and have fun with it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the most important parts is, like you said earlier on, you can't just jump into things 1,000%. You have to kind of like atomic habits, James Clear, like work up to them, start small. Sometimes it's just walking 5 minutes away from your house and you learn to like those things and you start to learn what you enjoy. And then, as a part of your, 3 things that you had mentioned here at the end of the podcast is like investing in a third party to help you either just ask questions, bounce things off of, maybe even just start you off on a program, maybe start with a coach who can assess your overall stress and identify areas that we can improve upon and start small and, understand what works best for you. Cause like you said, everybody's an N of one. So there's so much information on the internet that you're just looking for what worked for somebody else. Oh, this worked for that guy. Maybe I'll try it. This worked for that person. Maybe I'll try it. And it comes to a point.
We spend more time probably finding a good mechanic for our car versus finding somebody who can help us stay well.
Because you think you can do it on your own. And really, you just end up throwing shit at a wall and hoping it sticks, when really just a little bit of guidance to get you started and figure out what works best for you, because it's not going to work the best for everybody else. We have to figure out what works best for you. That's what's going to make this long-term sustainable. And that's what's going to make you want to enjoy your movement. And so you're bouncing in the backyard with your pogo stick, you're going for runs, you're mountain biking, you're lifting weights, you're shredding skateboards, like whatever it may be, you're finding things that work well for you because you realize that when you move well, you feel well. And when you feel well, you perform well. You have more energy for your friends, your family, your coworkers, your job, your business. Everything starts to get better because there's momentum now. So I love the concept of movement really is medicine, and people need to figure out what moving well means for them. So this has been just an amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed just hearing your perspective and, kind of diving into some of the intricacies of what makes good, healthy movement and how we can avoid injury and how we should start thinking about stress and movement management and injury prevention and all these things. I think people will learn a lot from this podcast, and I would like them to continue to learn from you. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, Ben. This has been a phenomenal conversation. And before we end, I would like to offer you a chance to just leave something with the listeners and just a final words of advice, and also give yourself the plug and tell people where they can find you.
Sure. I mean, I think that the best plug is when you treat movement as a lifestyle, you can do, as you said, Josh, it's start slow. Have a professional to give you feedback. I'm a huge fan of having a personal trainer for 3 or 4 sessions, even for somebody who says, I don't want to work with a personal trainer, to give you the tools, and then you do a reassessment. I think I really practice what I preach, although I would say I would like to move more. It's always, but I know that it is important. It is hard. So one of the things we do with one of my podcasts, FitLab Pittsburgh, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we do a 1-minute movement tip lifestyle hack video, just little simple things, usually with Labradors in the background. And then because you have to make it fun, because geez, we have a tendency to just be so serious about all this. Every Thursday, we also do a lab lessons or lessons from the Labradors. This past week, the Labradors gave us a lesson was don't overschedule. Mm-hmm. So I would say the best place for people to find more, it also, we post links for when we release podcasts for both Fitness Lab Pittsburgh and Moving2Live, is through Instagram at FitLabPGH. So both podcasts, when we release episodes, are on there. And every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you get a 1-minute movement tip lifestyle hack video.
Awesome. I love it, man. And we're definitely going to put the link to the podcast in the show notes. We'll put your socials in the show notes. I want people to be able to find you and kind of just continue to learn and make movement a healthier part of your life and a more consistent part of your life. So thank you again, Ben, for coming on and sharing your knowledge, your expertise. And thank you to everybody who stayed and continued to enjoy this episode. And thank you for listening to another episode of the Struggle to Strength podcast. We will see y'all next week.